Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jordan Frias, and I am with the Society of Professional Journalists New England chapter. And right now we're on Facebook Live, so please be sure to watch through there. If you have questions, please ask on Facebook Live, and I'll see them and read them at the end. But we are excited to be here today. We're with Seung Min Kim. She is of the Washington Post, and she's been nice enough to be our guest tonight to talk about her reporting on the White House. So, hi, Sungmin. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you guys? I'm doing pretty well in my basement. Thanks for
Excellent.
having me, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk to you about your title because it's a pretty unique title. Can you explain it to us?
Yeah. So my technical title is just White House reporter for the Washington Post, but the beat itself is actually pretty unique, and it's something that we a lot of news organizations don't have. So within our White House team, a lot of our reporters have different specialties. Like there are people who are really good on the foreign policy issues, domestic policy, things like that. So my little niche, my little beat is anything related to the White House administration and Capitol Hill. And we're kind of making we're kind of crafting the beat as we go along because the Post kind of created this beat for me when I joined in February of 2018. So I look at my beat in sort of two ways. One way is your classic stories about this White House and its relationship or lack thereof with Capitol Hill. So I've written a lot about how Trump and Mitch McConnell, these two diametrically opposed personalities, interact. I've written about clashes with the president and Senate Republicans, for example, and kind of those kind of classic relationship stories. I've written a lot on nomination fights because they just inherently involve the administration and what the administration wants and what senators are willing to do. So that obviously includes like the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation fight and a lot of other related confirmation fights. But also the second part of my beat is looking at using my Capitol Hill sources. I've covered Congress since in varying capacity since 2011. So it's using Capitol Hill sources to figure out what this administration is up to. So any White House reporter, not even necessarily Trump White House correspondents, but anyone who's covered the Obama White House, the Bush White House, any good White House reporter will tell you that one of the best ways to cover any administration is kind of the outside in strategy. So let's say you have a story idea. You don't always necessarily go straight to the White House press secretary, the White House press office for an answer. Sometimes you do, but if you have an idea, a way of getting at what any administration is doing or up to is talk to who the administration is talking to. So who are the lawmakers are talking to about some policy initiative? Who are the outside groups, these interest lobbies, and things like that, and work your way back in to figure out what the White House is doing and what their agenda is. So that's kind of like the second half of my beat. I use my sources on the congressional beat to figure out exactly what this White House is up to, which is sometimes really hard because a lot of times these senators themselves don't really know what the White House is up to. But it's kind of an interesting experiment and seeing kind of how to meld these two very interesting but different beats in terms of like how you approach each beat and whatnot. So it's been a really interesting experiment. And then also you just kind of do all the classic White House reporter beat responsibilities. So we have 7 reporters on the Washington Post White House team, which is one of the bigger White House teams in Washington. So we all kind of rotate a week where we're on duty. So when we're on duty, he travels when he travels. If we have a seat in the briefing room during a press briefing, we have a seat in there. If he goes to Bedminster, or it's a little bit different now travel-wise because of the pandemic, but before that, if he went to Bedminster in New Jersey or his club in Florida for the weekend, then we would be there. we would kind of be on call for any sort of the big daily Trump-focused stories, and we rotate among the 7 of us. So we do that, which means you get to ride on Air Force One, which is pretty cool, and also do a lot of foreign trips, which has been, I always tell people that Congress, no matter what, is the best reporting job in Washington, and we can talk a little bit more about why I feel that way. But the travel part of the White House beat, especially abroad, has been pretty cool.
Excellent. So I want to back up a little bit and talk, maybe go a few weeks back and talk about the RNC Convention. So I know the start of these conventions, you usually have a platform on what the party's going to stand for and run on. So can you talk to me about your coverage of that and kind of, in general, this party? I mean, you cover Congress, right? So what does this party seem to stand for, given the Hedge-Setter Convention?
So the platform issue is really interesting, in that this year the RNC didn't really do one. They were like, the platform is basically Trump, and you saw that a lot during the convention. And that's kind of one of the, going back to what I was talking about in terms of my beat, that's kind of the consistent sort of through lines or themes that we repeatedly touched upon in the course of reporting on the presidency, and not necessarily in my beat at the Washington Post, but when I was at Politico, and just seeing how Trump and Trumpism has transformed the Republican Party. Because a lot of what Trump supports and espouses and what he ran on in 2016 is so kind of diametrically opposed to these classic kind of Republican principles. He does have a lot of isolationist tendencies when it comes to the military. So that's why you see so many of the policy clashes that he actually has with Republicans in Congress is over, for example, troop withdrawals. Like the Syria troop withdrawal was a major fight back when it happened in November. The other issue where Trump's kind of natural tendencies, his politics, where that has collided so much with your traditional classic free market Republicans, is on trade. The Republicans are the party of free trade, but Trump is kind of like a proud protectionist. He's much more kind of democratic in that view. And I think that's in part what helped win these kinds of big kind of union working class states like Minnesota and Ohio last cycle. And that's very kind of not traditionally Republican in that sense. So policy throughout the Trump administration has kind of been like, Republicans will stand their ground when it really does conflict with their policy convictions, but most of the time they've kind of gone along with what Trump has said, which you kind of see encapsulated in the fact that they really didn't have a platform this year at the convention. And you kind of saw it through the convention events too. Like, it's just so focused on Trump's family, Trump's accomplishments, and kind of just the man himself. So that's actually been a really interesting storyline throughout his presidency. And also, like, if Trump loses, or if he wins another term and leaves the White House in 2025, like that's going to be always an interesting storyline for us after he leaves the White House. How much does like this Trumpism view stay around? Does the Republican Party kind of go back to its principles that Trump kind of upended and things like that?
Great. And one of the big things it seems like he's trying to push, from what I heard the last day, the first article I saw from you recently, was Trump announces more possible Supreme Court nominees. He co-wrote with Anne Marimo. So it seems like, reading your article and hearing from him on Hannity yesterday, Sean Hannity's show on Fox News, he seems to kind of be, in my mind, kind of like baiting Biden to release a list of nominees, which he can frame as radical. So how do you see this move, the Supreme Court nominee move?
So first of all, I thought yesterday's decision was kind of an attempt, and not a very successful one, to change the news cycle away from all the revelations in Bob Woodward's book. To be fair, we had heard from sources the day before that, we knew for sure that the announcement was coming this week. It could have been Wednesday, but it also could have been later this week. And if you notice, his announcement on the Supreme Court list was very hastily added to the schedule after all the Woodward questions came out, and he kind of stepped on the news cycle that he was trying to change, because he made his announcement. He listed the 20 names. He challenged Biden to release his own list of Supreme Court nominees, which he's not going to do. But then he answered questions about Bob Woodward, and as reporters, obviously we love we like it when the president answers our questions on the news of the day. But in terms of a political strategy, it again kind of took attention away from this thing that has been very critical to his success. I mean, the courts are the one kind of unequivocal success of the Trump administration. A huge part of that is due to Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and the work that he did, even while Obama was still in office, and it was unclear. It was far from clear that Trump would be the nominee and then eventually win the presidency. One of Trump's consistent statements that's kind of misleading, and which kind of drives me crazy because there is actually a pretty simple explanation, is he likes to say that he came into the presidency with an unusual amount of judicial vacancies, which is true. It wasn't just obviously the Scalia seat when Antonin Scalia passed away in 2016, but there was an unusually high number of vacancies in the appellate courts and in the district courts, which is really important because obviously only 1% of all federal judicial cases ever make it to the Supreme Court. 99% stop at the appellate level. And the reason why there were so many vacancies is because Mitch McConnell, for whom the judiciary is a very, very important issue, when he was majority leader for the last 2 years of President Obama's administration, he just stopped holding votes for judges. He did other things. He said, all right, President Obama has gotten more than enough of his judges confirmed. I wrote stories back in 2015 and early 2016 that it had been the fewest number of judges confirmed since the Eisenhower administration. And that was all very intentional by Mitch McConnell, because McConnell's very good at kind of looking at the long game here. And he just left all these vacancies open, hoping that a Republican president, no matter who it was, whether it was a President Trump or a President Ted Cruz or President Marco Rubio, would come in and fill these seats with, young conservative lawyers and young conservative judges. But what Trump likes to say is that he's Obama just left all these judges open for me. I don't know why. Why would Obama do that? There's a simple explanation for that. It was Mitch McConnell and not Obama, who the former president tried very much to kind of to fill them, and it was a lot of what McConnell did. Judges are a very important issue for Trump and the rest of the Republican Party, which is why yesterday's announcement could have actually been a big deal, but then Trump kind of went on and stepped on his own message. And it was a way to kind of excite the social conservatives, the evangelical voters, the Republicans who, may not like Trump's personality, but they are Republican voters, they're conservative voters, and they know that Biden would not be nominating these types of people to the Supreme Court. It's kind of an assurance vote for them. He's remember, I would be nominating conservative justices, and that's why you should vote for me. And because that's what happened, that's what helped a lot in his obviously in his presidency or his presidential campaign in 2016.
Excellent. So I'm glad you mentioned the Woodward book, because we're getting a lot of questions about that, of course.
Yeah.
The topic for today is covering Trump during, presidential elections. So I'm sure this is going to be an election issue. The first question we have is from Sarah. It says, have you gotten a glimpse of Woodward's book or reported on content? And what has it been like reporting on something a colleague just kept under wraps for so many months?
So I have not seen the Woodward book. I don't have a copy of it. I think it was really tightly held. So only my two colleagues, Phil Rocker and Bob Costa, and maybe an editor or two had access to the book, and for not very long. And then we wrote kind of the news story off it. And I know, and I think I remember reading a statement from our top spokeswoman yesterday, and I'm going to pull it up just so I get it correct. Because, fairly, Woodward got some questions that he is going to continue to answer for the next couple of days and the next few interviews that he has. about why he withheld all this very kind of revelatory and, you know, almost damning information about what Trump told him about the coronavirus as far back as, you know, as far back as February. And so I know, you know, there's been some questions towards, you know, not only Bob Woodward, but the Washington Post about kind of holding that material until now, you know, especially after nearly 200,000 dead. And I think, let's see. And I think what we had said, which I actually didn't know this until we announced it yesterday, that while Bob Woodward he is associated with the Washington Post. Obviously, he does have the title of associate editor. He obviously was, you know, part of Woodward and Bernstein and Watergate. But he reports and writes his book independently, actually, from the Post, and he doesn't share his findings with our Post in advance of his books being completed. So we had no idea, like the editors from like Marty Baron on down had no idea what Bob Woodward, what his knowledge was of his reporting, his, you know, 18 on the record conversations with Trump, and basically we kind of knew only a few days before the rest of the world knew. We got a copy of the finished book very recently and then published the story. So I think that's so in terms of having a colleague who breaks these like monumental and very surprising news, the Woodward situation is a little different because he does his books now and is reporting kind of very independently from the Post's daily news operation.
Thank you for that. So Sarah has one more question. She says, would it have been helpful to know as a reporter that Trump thought COVID was so serious 6 months ago?
What do you mean? What's been helpful, or?
Would it have been helpful as a reporter to have known this revelation 6 months ago?
Well, we're kind of like two minds about this. Well, first of all, any knowledge that the president of the United States has about the significance of such a public issue as like a public health crisis, a public kind of like, he needs to clearly disclose to the public what he knows to the extent that he can, obviously without compromising any national security issues, because it is unequivocally true that he was downplaying the severity of the virus a lot, and he admits to Bob Woodward that he downplayed it. You know, he has repeatedly, and he still to this day calls the virus a hoax. You know, on those early press conferences, he was really confident that the virus would go away. You know, he said it would be eradicated by Easter, which is obviously not true and did not happen, and went very much against like public health advice. So obviously the president had a role here in you know, informing the public of what he knew about the severity of the pandemic, which is why it was kind of stunning to see his private and very candid observations, you know, at the time of how bad this was, and kind of compare it to his comments publicly. I am not quite sure it would have made a difference. I know there's kind of like a raging debate on that right now. If Woodward had, you know, disclosed those comments back in February and shown kind of the contradiction between what Trump was saying publicly and what Trump was saying privately, it's hard for me to assess like if things would be different now and how things would be different now. But it certainly, it would, like the president of the United States and my colleague Phil Rucker, who was at the press conference today with the president, kind of got at this point and kind of questioned why, like, you know, you say you don't want to panic people, but you as the leader of a country and like the leader of the most powerful country in the world can certainly convey important public health information to the American people without alarming them. You know, it's not going around and screaming death, death, like President Trump said he didn't want to do today, and not saying anything at all. So so I think that's something that's going to be examined for a while. But I will say, like, with almost everything, if not basically everything in the Trump cycle, there's another news cycle that comes up in the Trump news cycle always. So how much the revelations kind of stick for Trump and how bad it is, it's really, really hard to tell.
It's funny as you speak. Yeah, Woodward's book Fear behind you. So
Oh, I know.
it's right behind your head. So I'm going to ask you another question about Woodward and then get back to the election. So we have a question from Mary. She said, given Bob Woodward's knowledge of the president's downplaying the COVID pandemic, and given over, like you said, almost 200,000 deaths, can you comment on? Can you comment a little bit more on his Woodward's responsibility? I mean, is there more you want to add to what you just said? I guess,
Not so much, because again, like, I don't want to weigh in on the debate of like whether it would have helped or not, because I honestly, I see the argument for both sides, if it would have made a difference or not. I think obviously Bob Woodward is facing questions that he should answer and has answered in some venues. I don't know. I haven't read, and I don't know personally kind of the terms of his interview agreements with his sources, but it's traditional. It's very common practice for sources to talk to book authors on an embargoed basis, because you are more candid, down the line. You may not want to speak about something in the heat of the moment, but if you know that what you say now is not going to come out until months later or at whatever time is, a lot of people, whether they're on the record or on background, they're much more apt to speak very candidly and tell you all these very interesting details for a book. If Bob Woodward had such an agreement, and again, I don't know whether he did, but it's just very common for book authors to do, then obviously reporting what Trump said would be an infringement of that agreement. And I don't know a lot of book authors who would do that. So it's, I know Woodward has talked to the AP. I think he talked to the AP yesterday. He'll talk to 60 Minutes, I think, this weekend. And he's also talking to the Today Show sometime next week to promote his book. And all these are questions that he's gonna face. And I personally would be really interested in seeing his answers for kind of this ethical challenge and kind of this like balancing act of, the president of the United States telling you something that is very like newsy and of public value, but like you are writing a book that is not coming out for months. I mean, I'm very curious to see what his answers are.
So Seung Min, tell us a bit more about how different COVID-19 coverage is compared to, the average coverage, especially during an election year. Like, would this have gone down differently if COVID wasn't in the picture? I mean, like,
it would be so different. I would probably be Zooming from like Michigan or Pennsylvania or Florida or somewhere. And it's just, I mean, this is my first presidential year where I do have more of a role in actually covering the presidential election, because I've been a congressional reporter for so long. So in any election year, I'm generally focused on the House races or the Senate races. So it's a little disappointing to not be able to travel as much. When I talked about our travel duties earlier, the general practice for the Washington Post is that wherever the president of the United States is, we want a body with him. Even if he's not doing public events, it's just the principle of having someone on the ground with the president at all times, which is why we, camp out at Bedminster in New Jersey on the weekends or in Florida when he's down there. You never know when something's going to happen, or like he's going to call a random press conference. He just calls people who are there. But for now, unless there's a compelling reason to do so, we only travel if we're part of the White House press pool. And for people who aren't, familiar with how it works, there is, whenever the president of the United States travels, there is a group of 13 journalists that always are with him at all times. So they're the ones who fly on Air Force One. They're kind of in this protective bubble with him. And now, since the pandemic started, you also get tested for COVID at the beginning of the day to make sure you are COVID-free when you are kind of in this bubble and very oftentimes in close proximity to the president. So of the 13, there's 3 wires, two kind of print journalists, which were part of that kind of rotation, a radio pooler, a, a, a TV producer or a correspondent, two TV camera folks and tech folks who do the hardest work because they're like running around all over the place with the giant cameras on their shoulders, and then 4 still photographers. So that's, I think the numbers are, so that's 13. So we travel with the president when it's our like rotation to be with him. I was with the president a few weeks ago when he went to Scranton, Pennsylvania. This is when he was kind of like trolling Biden at, in his hometown the night that Biden was delivering his acceptance speech at the DNC. So the fact that you're not doing as much traveling is weird. The fact that you're always just like wearing a mask is weird. Getting regularly tested for COVID when you're going to be in close proximity with the president is something that we've also gotten used to. And you're just dealing with all these new challenges. For example, not the past trip, but my trip before traveling with the president, it was to a trip in Florida. And a couple days, maybe like 24, 48 hours after that trip, another member of that 13-member traveling pool tested positive for COVID. So I was actually quarantined for 14 days, and I got tested twice with the actual like, nasal swab way up your nose where you can kind of like feel it under your eyes and like up here. And just like stayed home and went nowhere for 2 weeks straight for that. So like that's something that you kind of have to get used to. And also I spend as part of my beat covering, both the White House and the Hill, I spend considerable time on Capitol Hill. Actually, in a normal time, like I spend more time on the Hill than I do at the White House or traveling or even in the Washington Post newsroom. So, but what we've done for our Hill coverage is that we have 6 people at the Washington Post who are regularly on the Hill. So that includes me and 5 other reporters. And we are actually just like limiting 1 person per day on the Hill so we can social distance, that we can, our like corner of the press gallery is pretty small. It's like 6 feet long itself. So there's no way that like 6 people should be sitting there. So today was my Hill day, so I was up there, but like obviously like, we wear masks everywhere. When we have, it's hard to have like a one-on-one conversation with a senator because you're trying to stay away from them. But so it's a new normal that we've all kind of had to get adjusted to. And it's hard because so much, the Post really, before all this hit, really put a premium on having reporters on the ground, especially talking to voters to get a feel for how voters are feeling this election. Because obviously, not just us, but like, most of the political reporting population misjudged 2016 and were sure that Hillary was going to win and kind of missed this Trump fervor. So we were definitely prepared to have a lot of resources and on the ground, traveling, talking to voters in, Iowa, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And we really can't do that. We're trying to find, different creative ways. And, my colleagues who kind of do these voter focused stories are trying to find like kind of creative ways to do that. So that's also been hard too, because that's kind of the best part, traveling the country and kind of seeing, kind of getting getting that kind of firsthand pulse of the electorate, which is like hard, if not impossible to do when you're still in DC.
Thank you for that. So for those who don't know you, I just wanted to mention some things. So I watched you talk to AAJA about yourself. So I took some notes. So what I gathered is you're from Iowa City originally. You're a political analyst for CNN at CNN. You started working at the Post February 2018, but before that you were political covering the Senate and immigration policy, and then USA Today prior. So can you talk about how your prior roles prepared you for the role you have today?
Sure. Obviously, my just the experience that I had covering Congress helped significantly. I mentioned that the Post kind of created this seat for me, and it's something that A lot of news organizations have talked about doing in the past, having a White House person who is kind of focused on the Hill and knows the Hill really well, and can kind of use the Hill to cover an administration better. So obviously my background in covering Congress for Politico helped extensively in that way. You know, at Politico, what I love about Politico is that they really and what I miss is they really make congressional coverage kind of their crown jewel of their Washington coverage. And you know, Politico pumps a lot of resources into congressional coverage, and we cover every, you know, corner of Congress. So it was really a great, and you know, when I started covering Congress and I had like no clue how to walk around or where to walk around Capitol Hill, and I got lost everywhere, and I had like no idea who most of these lawmakers were. You know, I was working with, you know, people who had covered Congress for years, if not decades. So to learn from people like that and kind of just garner their, you know, even get a taste of like their institutional knowledge was such an amazing kind of opportunity. And at Politico, you know, I covered Congress. I had a lot of, you know, or not a lot, but like several kind of beats within the congressional beat. So obviously, you know, covered Congress. I focused in the last several years of covering Congress at Politico, I focused exclusively on the Senate. I always think this is, most reporters have a preference of which house of Congress they like to cover better. I'm by far much more a Senate girl than a House girl. I think the House people are, you know, interesting. I'll just say that. And then, I also cover the immigration fight in 2013. So, you know, rewinding a little bit, Mitt Romney in 2012 lost the Latino vote very badly to Barack Obama. And that was kind of the, you know, awakening that the Republican Party had after the 2012 election, in thinking that they really had to do what they could to make more inroads with Latino voters, and pursuing immigration reform was a big part of that. So people like Lindsey Graham, John McCain got together with, you know, the Chuck Schumers and the Dick Durbins and the Bob Menendezes of the world to create the Gang of Eight. So I covered that bill and that process basically, you know, in almost its entirety. So I got a really deep focus in kind of how it's like supposed to be, if that makes sense, kind of the schoolhouse rock of what typically legislating should be. Because a lot of covering Congress nowadays, I mean, way before Trump, I mean, this is like, and this has been years in the making, but you're kind of covering crisis, or function dysfunction. I mean, I started covering Congress in the summer of 2011, which was the document crisis, and that really terrible standoff between Republicans in Congress and President Obama, where they fought so much over raising the nation's credit limit. It led to the first credit downgrade by the S&P in the nation's history. And you know, I've covered like several government shutdowns. You know, I spent New Year's Eve 2012 on Capitol Hill covering, you know, the fiscal cliff, and, you know, as lawmakers kind of scrambled to make sure most of the tax rates for most Americans wouldn't increase. So it was really kind of nice to see like Congress do what we learned in civics class or like AP government in high school, that like this is technically how a bill becomes a law. And you forget about the fact that this immigration bill never became a law, but like how legislating is supposed to work. Because there's still plenty of great political stories. There's plenty of drama to be kind of had in that, you know, in that story. And I think reporters who covered healthcare back in 2009 and 2010 feel the same way. The formation of the Affordable Care Act, you know, covering policy in that deep of a level gives you not only expertise in that policy arena, obviously like learned a lot about the U.S. immigration system and immigration law covering that bill. And, you know, that knowledge follows me still here. I still write about a lot of immigration issues for the Washington Post. But you do just kind of gain that institutional knowledge of like, hey, like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to work. This is kind of like the background that you have. And and also just, you know, like the more that you cover something, you just keep gaining that like well of knowledge of like this is the context, this is like what Congress does, or like what they haven't done in the past. So that all kind of helps build the foundation for you know, the stories I've gotten to do, you know. So I covered Neil Gorsuch's confirmation for Politico, so a lot of the story you know, a lot of the story ideas that you have covering the Gorsuch nomination, you can kind of replicate that for the Kavanaugh nomination. Like, it's just, you just keep building over time, your kind of story ideas, your sources, your, you know, credibility and expertise on the Hill, your repertoire, and things like that.
Excellent. So I know that we talked to AAJA, you mentioned kind of like, you know, being able to like walk to the bathroom and find a congressperson that you want to talk to and kind of grab them and just like get a quote from them right away. I mean, how are you dealing with that? I mean, I'm sure you can't do that with COVID, right? So how are you dealing with getting sources and stuff?
It's tough because, I mean, we still, like when I'm on the Hill, like today, like you still kind of approach senators, and that's kind of one of the, and we can go back to the point that I was making earlier about how Congress is the best, like I think the best beat in Washington, and it's because of the access that you get to members. You know, Trump is a little different in terms of his access to the press. Obviously, he talks to reporters in these impromptu gaggles or impromptu events, you know, a lot. But you know, like if you cover the White House, you know, it's not like you get an interview with President Obama every day or President Bush or whatnot. But like I could literally, just because of the access that if you're a credentialed reporter on Capitol Hill, you can basically get in anywhere except for like members only elevators, and members only areas, which is like amazing. And I remember when I started covering the Hill and I saw, I didn't know a lot of senators, but obviously, you know, the big figures like John McCain and John Kerry. And like McCain's just like walking around by himself and reporters just like go up to him and like ask him questions. And that's how it works on the Hill. Like you just, most of the, there are sometimes formal interviews that you arrange if you want to do like for example, like a broader profile on a senator or something like that. But like, the vast majority of interviewing that you do are in like these one-on-one kind of unscheduled conversations with senators when you like literally run into them in a hallway. I had there's like a story that I've been wanting to work on, and I've been meaning to call the press secretary for the senator to try to get him on the phone, which I hadn't gotten around to doing. And then when I was on the Hill today, just like walking through the second floor, I saw the senator. So I was like, oh, hey, Senator, can I actually, I've been wanting to talk to you about the story. And then like we had a lovely 6-minute conversation as I walked back to his office building in Russell. So that's just kind of how it works. It's not great if you tend to sometimes be shy like me. I've had to get over that fear of just kind of like interrupting people. It is something that you do have to get used to. But the access that you get is amazing. And it's just like, yeah, it's literally like I could just be like, walking in, or I could just be like going to the vending machine to get a snack, and I like see a senator I talk to. So I just, I have my phone with me. So you just kind of be like, oh, hey, Senator, like I have a couple questions to ask you. So that kind of the ability, that transparency, that accessibility, the ability to just kind of question, so many lawmakers, and just kind of live among your sources and the people who make news and the people who you keep accountable as a reporter is a really, really amazing opportunity that we have.
So how does this work? I mean, I imagine that you must have a list of certain lawmakers that have a better relationship with Trump that you want to speak to. In my mind, I'm thinking like Lindsey Graham.
Oh, totally. Yeah. So after a while, we kind of learned which which senators he likes to call, and who kind of has his ear on every issue or on like certain issues or things like that. So obviously, like he talks to Lindsey Graham about almost everything. So Graham is a great source for kind of figuring out what he's up to. But yeah, you just kind of figure it out. Like, you know, he obviously talks to Mitch McConnell like basically every day, or almost every day, particularly if there's like a big congressional crisis going on. McConnell and Trump, I believe, have like a standing meeting once a month, especially lately, to talk about the state of Senate races. You know, Trump is close to John Barrasso, who's the third ranking member of Republican leadership. He loves Lindsey Graham. He talks to Tom Cotton very frequently. And what's really interesting about Trump is that he just like picks up the phone and like calls these senators without any warning, without any kind of arrangement. I've had senators tell me about how they've done like a Fox News TV hit or like a Sunday show hit, and they like take off their, you know, their interview is done and they take off their earpiece and get off the set, they check their phone and there's like a voicemail from the president of the United States because Trump just like saw them and he wanted to be like, good job, thanks for like defending me, or like, it's a really great point that you made. You also like get to learn which senators are very attuned with not only the president, but his staff and different members of his administration on various issues. So for example, whenever there's a story about the president's Venezuelan policy, it's like like you always talk to Marco Rubio of Florida because he's always in touch with the State Department, White House, national security staff about those kinds of issues. So you kind of learn over time who knows what or who should know what, which is kind of goes back to the point of my beat. Like a lot of my beat is figuring out what the White House is doing, and just by talking to the people that the White House talks to. So that's like a fun challenge of this job too.
So how do you see your job changing after this election? I mean, there's going to be senators that come and go and possibly a new president. How do you see your job changing?
I actually don't see it changing that much. I know there's been just some chatter among, just among like us who cover the White House in varying capacities. Like obviously people who came in with the Trump administration by covering the Trump campaign, they might leave if Biden wins, or we're all exhausted. So if Trump is gone, we may all just kind of switch to different beats too. But I see my role and kind of my beat as pretty consistent, regardless of whether Biden wins or Trump wins, because Biden, whether there is a Republican Senate or a Democratic Senate or a split Congress or, a full Democratic Washington, I mean, a president is always going to have a really interesting dynamic with Congress, good or bad. And there's always going to be stories. Biden obviously has his allies on the Hill too, who can tell reporters or me what they're up to. So we haven't really discussed this as like a Washington Post team yet, but my role doesn't like have to change depending on who wins the White House, if that makes sense.
So it's funny because when I think about your role in kind of covering Trump through his relationship with Congress, I kind of think of like the assumption that I get from reading a lot of news is that Trump doesn't really, especially with the coronavirus, fund, like the emergency funding and stimulus and all that, he doesn't really negotiate with Congress. It's more like minutia and stuff. So yeah. Is that accurate to say? I mean, how does this?
Yeah, that's totally accurate, and that's part of the stories that I do too, because my beat isn't just Trump's relationship with Capitol Hill, but it's the administration's relationship. So a recent story that I did like sometime back in August when a lot of these COVID negotiations were going on was Mark Meadows, the new White House chief of staff, as like negotiator, because he is this guy who before in the Trump era was best known as like the thorn in the side of Republican leadership. He was the guy who basically got Boehner booted from his speakership because he threatened to this very kind of arcane procedural move to try to get Boehner out of his speakership. And he fought constantly with Speaker Paul Ryan. He was kind of like the no faction in the House Republican Conference. And then obviously Trump came in, Meadows was really close to him. So you heard a lot of what Trump was thinking through Meadows when Meadows was a congressman. But Meadows is he didn't have like as deep of a legislative background, so it was a really interesting story to kind of get to try to explore Meadows as like a deal maker when he's always been kind of like the deal. This is cheesy, but like when he's always been kind of like the deal breaker, and also and especially when Democrats don't like him. Democrats actually like Steve Mnuchin, which has been an interesting kind of evolution of a relationship throughout the Trump presidency, and that Steve Mnuchin becomes one of the Trump administration officials that Democrats like the most. But that's also part of my beat, like how has Meadows gone from Congress to the White House, and how is he in this role as like negotiating a deal for the on behalf of the president. And we got these, my colleague Erica and Josh and I got these great details about how he told senators like, look, like if I were still a member of Congress, this is like not something I would be negotiating. Like I would I might even like vote against this deal, but like I am here kind of negotiating on behalf of the president of the United States, who wants an agreement. So that's a really interesting storyline too that we've been exploring at the Post, especially as part of my beat. And you're going to get a lot of those stories too in a potential Biden administration. He'll clearly elevate a lot of, there are several, potential cabinet nominees from Congress. So that'll be an interesting dynamic. And the Biden-McConnell relationship is a really, really fascinating one that goes back decades. So I don't think, this would be hard to see politically, but if Biden is elected and Republicans are still in control of the Senate, how Biden navigates Mitch McConnell and how McConnell and Biden kind of, clash with each other despite their long shared history is going to be a really good story too.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think you said that this is your first time covering the election. Is that accurate? Or?
This is my first time like being in a position to cover the presidential election. So like obviously in a presidential year, it's kind of like all hands on deck and everyone covers everything. But in 2012, in both 2012 and 2016, I was a congressional reporter. So I was like I may pitch in on the occasional campaign rally trip once in a while. Like I think in 2012, I went to a couple of like Biden and Obama events in like New Hampshire and Wisconsin. But like I was more focused on like congressional state of play stories. And in 2016, most if not all my travel were to states where there were competitive Senate races. Like I spent a lot of time in Indiana covering the Indiana Senate race between Todd Young and Evan Bayh. So this is like my first real kind of year where I am in position to like cover the, help as part of our kind of, I'm not the lead Trump campaign reporter, nor do I want to be for the Post. But I am part of a group who would be covering that. So that's why it's kind of, sad to not be out there every day. Trump is obviously much more apt to travel than Biden is, and Biden's picking up his travel, and obviously he'll pick it up more through the election, through election day. But Trump unequivocally is doing a lot more travel, and to his detriment. Like if you've seen the photos from his rally that's going on in Michigan right now, the crowds are like intense. There's not a lot of social distancing. It seems to be clear that it violates the 150 to 200 person restriction that Governor Whitmer has on events in Michigan. So there are obvious kind of public health safety issues involved there. But just, all that aside, and I know that's like a big aside, I think just as reporters, we miss being out in the country and like seeing what voters feel about this kind of really interesting moment in political history, even before the pandemic began.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask you about one of the articles I read from you. It says the title was GOP Women Warn of Eroding Support Among Female Voters Amid a Gender Chasm. Mm-hmm. So like my question to you is, do you fear that reporters maybe missing even more so with the virus, the likelihood that there might be another Trump victory? Because it seems like a lot of focus is going to be on Biden's gaining steam. I mean, is there like a fear that what happened in 2016 Hillary Clinton is going to happen again with Biden?
Well, I think reporters are being much more careful not to be so predictive. And, you know, I also want to, you know, a lot of times the media get the blame for what says on cable TV. But remember, on cable TV, a lot of people who are talking are like political pundits whose kind of job or whose task is to predict what happens. Whereas I think reporters try to kind of be much more, here's what our reporting shows, here's what our sources are telling us, here's what voters are telling us, to try to reflect the reality of what happens right now. So I really hope our reporting kind of reflects what is happening and not try to be so predictive. I mean, we have a really great poll that we do with ABC News. We have a great polling staff who are super good with helping us analyze data. But, you know, like, this is like the world's cheesiest phrase, but like the only poll that really matters is on election day. And, you know, a lot of the state polls, and then the national polls were pretty spot on, but a lot of the state polls in 2016 were off. And, you know, they could be like very well off again this year, especially with how close some of these margins are in a lot of these swing states. So I think reporters are trying to take care to like not be so predictive. I know there was a sense kind of back in July and early August that like Biden kind of like had it in the bag. We were going to have a Democratic Senate. But obviously, like, there's a sense now that everything is kind of, you know, with some exceptions, like things are tightening. Various voters are, you know, kind of coming home to their respective parties. All this, you know, most if not all the states are getting closer in their margins. Pennsylvania seems to be the one where it does seem to be kind of consistently good for Biden. And I think we're just kind of continue to see that tighten more and more. The interesting thing is just the impact of early voting too, because so many people are going to have voted before election day. So, for example, if there is like an October surprise, like, does it matter if, you know, tens upon millions of people have voted already? And that's an interesting story for wherever you are. I mean, it's an interesting story for national reporters based in DC and New York, but like anybody in any community in any state, how much you know, later news matters because so many people are voting early this year.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good point about like early voting. I mean, there's a scandal going on at the post office right now, you know, Louis DeJoy. So talk to me more about kind of what priorities seem to matter to Trump through Congress. I mean, I'm sure there's some things he's wanting them to push more on or push back more on. Like, for example, is he trying to get them to, you know, push against the post office? Is that something you saw from talking to people?
So right now, the post office is not something as a political issue that seems to worry Republicans just yet. Trump has clearly kind of downplayed the impact of these, you know, delivery issues. The post office right now as a political issue is more kind of congressional Democrats going after Louis DeJoy and USPS kind of more on an investigatory level, because I don't really see like them coming to an agreement on additional post office funding before election day. So I think what we kind of have to do as journalists just to continue to monitor any sort of problems with mail delivery that we're hearing on the ground in these key states. And that's kind of, you know, that's kind of like our role right now, to see like how well these problems are being solved, like what problems do elected officials continue to hear from their voters in terms of like how late their prescription deliveries are, or like if they get their ballots, or if they get like multiple, you know, like we just kind of have to keep monitoring the problems, and that's one way we'll be covering that big issue.
So I want to be respectful of your time. I know we have about 3 minutes or so. I hope you don't mind going a little bit longer if possible.
That's totally fine, yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. So one question we have here is just, what's some of the biggest differences between covering Congress and the White House?
So covering Congress is like a zoo, which is why it's so much fun. At a White House, you have kind of, I mean, taking this one as sometimes an exception because the Trump White House has so many like warring internal factions that have been written about over and over. But traditionally, in a White House and in an administration, you have one kind of focus, one agenda, one person and their agenda kind of being implemented and promoted and pushed. But in Congress, you have 535 personalities, 535 agendas, 535, and it's so fun to see and so interesting to see how they all kind of collide with each other and how that and how that and what kind of a dynamic that creates. And especially with the House, sometimes with the Senate, but definitely with the House, just with sheer number of people. I mean, you see the diversity of America, not diversity necessarily in terms of the number of women or racial diversity, because obviously Congress needs to be doing better on that front, but like kind of the diversity of just America and kind of the character of like so many different parts of the country be represented in Washington. So that's also just really kind of interesting and fun to see. And just how these, hundreds of personalities can come together or not come together in times of crisis like we are right now. That's just, it's just such a, it's just such a really important story to cover. But yeah, I think just the huge difference is that, Congress has, all these, dueling personalities and dueling agendas, and how that works or doesn't work with what needs to get done on any given day, what crisis needs to get resolved or what agenda needs to be accomplished is just really interesting compared to a White House, which has just one agenda, or which should just have like one person's agenda, one person's priorities focused. Also just an interesting, a different thing, an interesting thing too, just kind of having a foot in both places, is seeing where the power has gone. And this is an issue obviously long before the Trump presidency, but for years, if not decades, but definitely for years, you've had Congress, because of because of constant congressional dysfunction and gridlock, cede so much of their power to the executive branch, to the White House. And so to see kind of one branch lose power because they are just sort of kind of in this constant gridlock, while the other kind of just gains power by taking executive actions, executive orders. And you've seen definitely how President Trump loves, taking executive actions, even if a lot of them don't have much teeth and it's more something that he just wants to say and get headlines for. That's an interesting dynamic too, and kind of the difference between Congress and the White House. One branch seems to be perpetually losing or is ceding power, while one branch gains it or is taking it, which is interesting to watch.
Excellent. So I think we're.
And also, you travel so much more on the White House beat, which is awesome. So.
There you go.
Yeah.
So I think we're just gonna ask one more question, actually. Thank you so much for your time again. This one's a little different. It's just kind of to know about, just what are some of the biggest differences between covering, no, sorry, I already asked that one. Yes, already. What's the day in the life of Seung Min Kim look like? As average as you can get.
Well, there's no average day covering Trump, so that's kind of the hard part. So I can give you like a couple different average days. So, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I still, despite my White House beat and the White House job, I still spend, most of my days on Capitol Hill, talking to senators about what the White House is up to and whatnot. So, I wake up, if I've been sleeping in like a little bit more and more lately, I think just because of the pandemic, but I wake up early, wake up sometimes to a lot of tweets from overnight or to a very early rising president. If I'm able to make it to a 6 a.m. yoga class, I can't tell you how many times I've come out of a 6 a.m. yoga class at 7 a.m. and there's like this crazy stream of tweets from the president. Sometimes the tweets set the agenda for the day. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes, we've kind of learned you know, I think when we started covering Trump the president, we were so used to like thinking that, you know, almost every presidential statement, especially if it's like really unusual, is like news, but you kind of get used to, you kind of become much more judicious about the news that Trump is making and making sure you're kind of, you know, adding all the proper context to what Trump says, because obviously he is someone that needs a lot of that background and context. Um, you know, so sometimes those tweets set the agenda for the days, you know, sometimes they don't. Um, and then I would, you know, I would make my way to the Hill. I usually have a plan of attack for the day. You know, there are storylines I'm pursuing either for the day or either for um, or longer term, more enterprising stories throughout the week. So I always kind of like make a list of, I always make a to-do list, and then also after getting in touch with my editors or whatnot, I make a list of like senators I need to talk to. So I was like, all right, for this thing that I'm pursuing, I would like to see senators ABC in the hallways. I want to try to track them down and talk to them. You know, for this other story, like I should really get these 5 guys. And I just do my best throughout the day to like, you know, talk to them. There are a few opportunities to talk to senators. You know, they generally vote most every day. So when they vote is one of the most common times to catch senators in the hallways, because obviously like everyone has to go to the Senate chamber to vote. And they also meet for lunch every day or every other day, depending on whether you're Democrats or Republicans. So like when they all go to this meeting room for their caucus lunch, where they kind of strategize or they they hear updates from leadership or whatnot, that's another chance to, that's another chance to like catch the senators that I'm looking for any given story. You know, you can like, I always tell people like, if you're a good, like, if you've been like a crazy ex-girlfriend stalker, you're going to be like a really good congressional reporter. So much of it is like, all right, I know this senator has this committee hearing at like 10 a.m. So I'm going to like stalk him outside the hearing room to try to get him there. So it's just kind of like tracing like people you need to talk to, their patterns. You know, like I'm texting or calling people, like calling sources on the phone for what I need. I spend most of my time like in the hallways too, because that's the great thing about the Hill. You not only run into speakers, you also run into like staffers, your sources, who tell you things. You know, sometimes I don't, you know, it's just human nature. Like, you know, if I may not proactively call you or, you know, or text you with something, but if I like see you, sometimes I'm like, oh, I meant to tell you this thing. So if the only times I'm like ever at my desk when I'm on the Hill is like when I have to sit down and file and write a story. Otherwise, I'm just like wandering around, talking to senators, you know, talking to people on the phone and like running into people, seeing what's going on, you know, like you just like, you're walking down the hallway and like you see, you know, James Mattis like randomly on the Hill. You're like, what is he doing here? And there's like a secret briefing on a military, like that's just kind of how Congress works. So a lot of covering Congress is like being lucky and being kind of in the right place at the right time. But like you can't get to be in the right place at the right time unless you are like physically out there and always kind of wandering around and talking to people and just being there. That's why it's tough part, like, you know, being home most of the time. You just like don't get the same kind of experience.
So it sounds like if you're a great stalker, then Congress is for you to cover.
Yeah, I know. Congress is, you know, if you're a great stalker, if you can like trace people's patterns pretty well, then yeah, you know, covering, you'll be great at like tracking down your sources.
I guess I'll work on my stalking skills now. Well, Seung Min, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. I really want to thank you again for all the time you took to speak with us. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, thanks for having me. And it was a pleasure answering all your questions.
Excellent. So again, this is Seung Min. She's from the Washington Post, and we can't wait to read all her coverage up to Election Day. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
All right, take care, everyone.
All right, bye.